By the 5th century AD, Britain split from the Roman Empire and turned into a bunch of fighting areas. From these, the medieval kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Wales grew. People were moving around a lot, especially along the coasts of Ireland and the North Sea. The biggest movement was when the Anglo Saxons came from northern Germany and southern Scandinavia and settled in eastern England. In today's video, I will be talking about the Anglo Saxon invasion and the beginnings of the English. Welcome back to Epic Explorer Guys with another knowledge-packed video. First of all, let's talk about the migration history of Anglo-Saxon. There are two early accounts of the Anglo-Saxon migration were written by authors who were both Christian clerics, named as Gildas and Bede. Gildas was actually a British and wrote in about 500 AD. Probably he lived in southwestern Britain. He describes in his account the departure of the Roman army, followed by the arrival of bloodthirsty invaders who killed the native British population or drove them into exile. That was his thoughts about the Anglo-Saxon invasion. Now let's talk about the thoughts written by the Bede. 200 years later, Bede, who was an Anglo-Saxon monk in the monastery of Jarrow, wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people, which he completed in 731 AD. He drew his lines on Gildas's work, but in his own account describes the Anglo-Saxon invaders as his own ancestors, as those carrying out the just vengeance of God and therefore being a people chosen by God. Bede also gave a precise date, 449 AD, for the first arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, and he said they came from three tribes, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, who themselves came from different parts of Germany and Denmark. The Angles were from Angelen, which is a small district in northern Germany, and the Saxons were from what is now Lower Saxony, also in northern Germany, and the Jutes were from Jutland, which is now part of Denmark. According to Bede, the Angles settled in East Anglia, the Saxons in southern England, and the Jutes in Kent and the Isle of Wight. The name Anglo-Saxon comes from the fusion of the names of two of these peoples. The terms English and England came from a further shortening and mix of these words, all these terms coming from the name of a small district in northern Germany, Angelen. Now the question arises here, was Bede's story correct? Bede's story has been so influential that many scholars have taken it as their starting point rather than as a piece of historical evidence to be tested. The tribes Bede names in his account have been understood as the names of distinct peoples who arrived in separate groups, all from specific places, but Bede was explaining regional differences that existed in his time, in terms that made sense to him at that time, but the actual migration happened centuries after Bede wrote his account. More interested information to share here, the archaeological evidence suggests that Britain's people were much more mixed. The incomers did not all come from the same place at the same time, but in separate groups, and many of these groups had regional differences. And let me tell you, any story that says the Anglo-Saxons quickly kicked out all the Britons and took over is missing a big chunk of the tale. No such evidence is present. This whole thing took centuries. It didn't happen overnight. This gradually expands in other parts of Britain. Crossing the North Sea by boat was not easy. Like the early European journeys across the Atlantic to discover America, there were not difficult, unusual and dangerous voyages to unknown lands. People had been traveling by boat around the coasts of northern Europe for thousands of years, and trade across the Channel was established long before the Romans arrived. During the Roman period, people had moved around the empire, many of them coming to or traveling from Britain, and movement didn't end completely even when the Romans left the Britain. The Britons knew about the peoples of Germany and Scandinavia as traders, slaves, or pirates, and the Anglo-Saxons knew about the land they decided to come to, and once they arrived, they were able to make repeat journeys to return home or to bring more of their family over. Now, after these historical accounts, now I will be talking about the truth about Anglo-Saxon migration. People have argued a lot about how many Anglo-Saxons came and how many Britons survived when they invaded. The big question is whether the changes in culture and language happened. because a bunch of Anglo-Saxons took over, or if it was more about the Britons adopting the Anglo-Saxon way of life after the Roman Empire fell apart. People have used language, digging up old stuff, and studying genes to try to figure out what really happened. Some say there were between 2 to 6 million people in Roman Britain, based on how much land was used and how many settlements there were. That's about the same or even more than the number of people in England in 1087 AD. According to the Domesday Book, there was probably a population decline at the end of the Roman period, but still we can only guess at actual numbers, no concrete historical evidence reported till day. In some areas, for example, Norfolk and the Vale of Pickering in Yorkshire, the density of Anglo-Saxon settlement has been shown to be on rise. In some other places, like near Hadrian's Wall in northern England as well. Historians says that in those days, there were a lot of deforestation happened in Roman times. And those forests grew up in rapid time, which indicates there were less population in the area. This is what historians suggest. Even if the name Engel was applied to people living in a larger region of North Germany and Denmark, there were not enough of them to wipe out and replace all of the people already living in the east and south of Britain. The story is more complicated than that, but it is certainly a story about people moving and arriving in a new country where they and their descendants had a big impact. After the Anglo-Saxon invasion, the way people used to speak in lowland Britain has been totally changed. They stopped speaking British or Latin and started speaking Old English, which is kind of like the grandparent of the English which we speak today. In early Anglo-Saxon villages, they started building a new type of house called a Grubenhaus, which had a big hole under the floor. Also, they brought in new type of clothes, weapons and pottery. It's kind of new way of living for the people here in Britain. It's like beginning of new culture. It's pretty clear that these new folks brought their stuff and their ideas about making pots, burying the dead and building houses. But it's hard to know exactly who was using these things because even local people might have started using them too. Some of the fancy brooches or pots might have been used by immigrants, but maybe some were used by locals whose families had been there for a long time. So, it's not as simple as saying everything was brought by the new folks. There was probably a mix of cultures blending together about 15 centuries ago. Back in the days when the Jutes from Denmark settled in Kent, you could see their influence in fancy gold pendants called bracteates. These were common in southern Scandinavia around the 5th century, but other stuff like jewelry, pots, and glass things found in Kent looked more like what the Franks used in the Rhineland and northern France. Kent was tight with the Franks politically and economically in the 6th and 7th centuries, so they probably shared some style tips. Anglo-Saxon people have also introduced new way of burying the people. In East Anglia, where the Angles settled, they buried their dead with clothes, fasteners and pots that came from all over the place around the North Sea. Some were from Saxon areas, some from Anglian regions. Our idea of how the Anglo-Saxons came to Britain is that in some spots like Norfolk, a bunch of them arrived early in the 5th century, but in other places they came later and there weren't as many. Some of these newcomers were tough warrior gangs who didn't have much trouble taking over. In other areas, the local folks stuck around, but their leaders either started acting like Anglo-Saxons or got replaced by them, which made everyone start acting more like Anglo-Saxons too. The Anglo-Saxon migration did add a lot of people to England, but maybe not as many as some folks thought. And it didn't change every part of the country the same way. Lots of people today probably have Anglo-Saxon ancestors, but figuring out exactly where they come from and how they mixed with other folks is a lot trickier than what Bede and his buddies might have said. I hope you enjoyed today's video. We tried to cover all aspects of the Anglo-Saxon migration into Britain. Thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing our channel and share the video with others. Please hit the thumbs up. We will catch you in another video. Take care.